Hi everyone, this lecture is going to be on plyometrics and how we can program for plyometrics. There are three lectures that are going to be comprised of this lecture series, right? First is what is plyometrics, defining it. Second is understanding the stretch shortening cycle. And the third is understanding what the prerequisites are for having our clients engage in a plyometric training program, as well as how to put together a plyometric training program design. So let's start with what is plyometrics. I want you to pause and I want you to think about how would you describe plyometrics to a friend, right? What are some key components that go into plyometrics? So think about that, maybe even write it down in your notes, and when you're ready, let's move forward. Plyometrics, by definition, is high velocity resistance training, and that's really key because high velocity means high speed. So essentially what we are looking for is we want a very quick eccentric contraction that is immediately followed by a very quick concentric contraction of that same muscle. Okay, so plyometric training is high velocity resistance training that involves a rapid eccentric contraction followed by a rapid concentric contraction of that same muscle. So in essence, it's both a resistance and power training move or movements. And it includes the use of our stretch reflex and natural elastic components of our muscle and tendon. And we use these so that we can increase the power of our movements as well as strengthen the muscles and tendons functionally. So you're going to learn more about that stretch reflex and natural elastic components in a later part of this lecture series, but it's important to know that those two things are included in how we are able to actually engage in plyometric training. So let's talk about the purpose of plyometric training. Truthfully, the main purpose is so that we can heighten the excitability of the nervous system, so that we can improve our reaction or reactive ability of the neuromuscular system. So by definition, if you're thinking about this goal, this main purpose, this purpose of plyometric training really aligns with a lot of why athletes train, right? They want to improve their reaction time, they want to enhance their neuromuscular system so that they can be more athletic in their movements, right? And so that's the main purpose of plyometric training. Now you're thinking about, well, what about why am I doing this for my clients who are non-athletes? Well, what happened is traditionally we use plyometric training with athletes, and then our kind of regular clients saw those movements and or used to use those movements when they were athletes and kind of craved that challenge, right? And this kind of goes along with the trend of HIIT training. And so what's great about plyometric exercises is that while it is strength training, it's also can be very cardiovascular in nature. So people who don't have a lot of time, who want a neuromuscular challenge, who want some strength training but also some cardiovascular, plyometrics are often a great way to, or a great thing to include in your training with them. So the goal of plyometrics is to decrease the amount of time that's required between that eccentric and concentric movement, remembering that it's of the same muscle. So in order to understand this, we want to make sure that we also go back and understand the difference between eccentric and concentric movements, right? So concentric movements are going to be those that are shortening the muscle. So in this example, we have the shoulder. If we are to raise our shoulder from our side up to 180 degrees, that's a concentric movement because that deltoid is actually shortening. If we were to lower the arm back down, that deltoid is lengthening to allow for that range of motion, and so that's an eccentric movement within the deltoid. Same thing with the quadriceps or hamstrings, right? As we go down into a squat position, we know that our quadriceps are actually going through an eccentric movement. But then as we come back up into that kind of more standing position, that's a concentric movement. So going back to this, the goal of plyometric training is that we decrease the time between that eccentric contraction and then overcoming that concentric contraction. So plyometrics, normal physiological movement rarely begins from a static starting position. So what we really need to work on is our eccentric pre-stretch, right? So that's usually where our movement starts. And so that's the whole foundation of plyometric training, is saying we don't usually start from this static position. Usually we need some sort of eccentric pre-stretch before we do engage in some sort of movement pattern. And so let's go ahead and train that movement pattern. Let's train that eccentric pre-stretch. Plyometric training has consistently demonstrated the ability to improve the production of muscle force and power, which is why a lot of athletes engage in plyometric training. And plyometric training can be explained into two models, the mechanical model and the neurophysiological model. And both of those are encompassed in the stretch shortening cycle. I'm going to go into those in more detail in the next lecture. But for now, what I would like you to do is just have a quick learning recap. So I want you to pause. I want you to be able to define, you can write this down or type it out, define your plyometric training. So how would you define this type of training, and describe the goal for plyometric training? What's the purpose and what's the goal of plyometric training? You should be able to do that, and when you're ready, let's go ahead and move on to the next lecture.